All right, well, welcome everyone back to another episode of Unusual Attitudes. Very special guest today, Dr. Ben Waber, visiting scientist at MIT, co-founder of the company Humanize, and author of People Analytics, a 2013 bestseller on the New York Times book list. And so welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. So my first question for everyone always is a little bit about who you are and what you're about. So who's Dr. Ben Waber?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm probably a lot of things, but yeah, I mean, a lot of, you'd mentioned that I'm, visiting scientist over at MIT. I also have I've got another position at MIT, also at Nitsumeikan University, but really at a high level, a lot of what I do is trying to use data to understand how people interact and collaborate at work, and then understand how that relates to outcomes we care about, like productivity, job satisfaction, what have you. And then, even going beyond that, thinking about as we start to have that data, what does that mean for how we can, improve work for a lot of people? How can we change the way that organizations function to, make just the economy at a more macro level healthier?
Well, I mean, why go into the field of people analytics and understanding, how people interact in organizational ecosystems and trying to optimize that experience or analyze and optimize that experience? Like, why is that an interest for you?
Yeah, well, it's sort of I got into this from a sort of, random area where actually when I was doing, my BA, my MA at Boston University in computer science. So I was already doing some research actually in computer vision. Again, actually around trying to use, data from video to make interfaces for people with disabilities. And as I was reading papers by people in the space, this one name kept coming up, papers kept coming up. This guy, Sandy Pentland over at MIT. And as I started to read some of his more recent papers, they were much more around sort of networks, sort of, again, relationships and interactions between people and how that related to societal level outcomes. So that, as I read more about that topic, that got to be pretty interesting. And then when I was, fortunate enough to get into MIT for my PhD and actually be in his group, I was still interested in this topic, but a lot of the work that I'd been focusing on, at least, when I started, was more in the lab setting. It wasn't in a corporate context. But then actually, a professor from Sloan from the business school came by the lab one day. He'd been working with us on a variety of different things. And he said, well, I'm actually studying this bank in Germany, and I'm collecting all of their email data. I've got, daily surveys, more involved surveys. I have the performance data, all this other stuff. And we're trying to understand what, predicts organizational effectiveness when it comes to behavior. Do you think you could use, so we've been developing these sensors to look at interactions in the lab. Do you think you could do that for a longer period of time, in an office environment? And I said, well, probably. So me and Tammy Kim, Daniel Olgan, the three of us thought that sounded interesting. And we'd never done anything like that before. So we go over to Germany, we collect this data for a month on, who interacts with who and all these other things. And, the longer discussion about that whole process is in sort of flying by the seat of our pants type thing. But so when we finally get this huge amount of data, it's probably, this is like the beginning of 2007. And this is by far the probably largest data set at the time that anyone had ever collected in history on how companies functioned. But so at that point, we just did the simplest analysis we could think of. We're just let's just look at who talks to who, like that network, right? We had 4 gigabytes per person per day at that time. So there's a lot of different ways we could have sliced it. But we said, all right, simplest thing, let's look at that. And then let's try to predict, again, things like job satisfaction, things like performance. And we could really accurately. It was 4 times, more predictive than pretty much all the other data put together, right? So that was interesting. And when we sent an early draft of that paper to, the executive team at this, again, it was this large German bank where we'd gone and collected this data, and they'd let us do the study. So we're like, okay, here's, our initial findings. And they said, wow, that's great. We're actually going to do a reorg of the whole company based on this analysis. This is a multi-billion-dollar institution, right? We're a bunch of grad students who just did like the first cut we could possibly think of. And so that was interesting, right? Like the idea that, like I had always assumed that when especially big companies made big people decisions, they must collect a lot of data and run tests, and based on those tests, make those decisions. And I was very quickly disabused of that notion. But it, I think indicated to us how, um, just untapped this new kind of data was in that whole space. And then, as we went on in our PhDs, we're collecting more and more data from different companies, starting to look at new kinds of metrics one could look at. And then eventually we were actually changing how companies were being managed based on our analysis. And then I could prove at that point that there were, thousands of people who measurably liked their jobs better, made more money, and their companies made more money. So what we did, and that seemed to be worth my time. And so that's when we started the company and sort of continued from there. But yeah, that's maybe the not so brief version of how I
Yeah,
got
it's
into
almost like you
this.
you
Yeah,
you backdoored your way into it, kind of. But what I find interesting about it is just what you said. It's a little bit untapped. You think that organizations have all this people data, and whether they use it or not, is up to the organization's leadership. But the reality is, the data actually doesn't exist, or even at the time that you were writing the
yeah,
book,
yeah,
which is still the sort of the gold standard of trying to understand, how people interact in your organization, and listening
yeah,
to the water cooler talk,
yeah,
those are really important things. But companies, even still today, I think, are struggling from a understanding really what makes their people successful or unsuccessful in organizations. I think part of it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong,
yeah.
and I can only base it on my experience, is I think it's a two-part problem. The first is the systems by which we use to manage people
Hmm.
are the wrong systems,
Yep.
right? That isn't to point a finger at the ATSs and HCMs out there, but the purpose, why they were built, and the framework legacy architecture that they're built on, essentially these older, ERP systems, and basically we modeled people systems off of product systems,
Yeah.
right? We took a product system and says, oh, we could just plug people into that, and we'll start to understand. And I think the notion of it was well intended. The problem is the system not only doesn't collect the right data,
Yeah.
it doesn't know how to present the data. And so
Yep.
luckily over the last 10 years or so, like other companies, like even like Phenom and some of the other ones out there, we're popping up and we're saying, no, you really need to pay attention to this. In your view, has there been enough change in the right direction to really start to understand how we truly measure people, and make that data available to leadership? What really needs to change?
Yeah. I think that, sort of to your point, if you go back at this, I don't know, 15 years or something like that, then you can pretty definitively say that the necessary precondition to improving people management, right, was, this kind of, infrastructure and ability to collect and analyze data, which was just not there, right? It was just not there at the time, right? Again, it's not to say one couldn't like build that stuff internally, but that was, pretty heavy lift. I think where we are now is, like you were saying, there's companies like, Phenom, there's there's a bunch of ways, like one can now not credibly claim that it's impossible to gain access to this kind of data. Right now, again, one can quibble about the exact metrics you get, all these other things, but like that's there, right? However, and I think that's great, and I think that's one of the reasons you've seen the whole people analytics industry grow to where it is today, which is pretty cool. At the same time, it is still very limited by a lot of, I think, more systemic and structural problems when it comes to management, that we still have to deal with, and that technology by itself will not solve. Again, is a necessary precondition, but it will not solve, right? Which has been probably more of my focus the last couple of years. Again, part of the problem, which I'll also just sort of lay out there. Well, there's a couple. So one is that I do think that, you were saying, like, we have all these systems and, that sort of have inherited this legacy from product systems. one of the problems is that I fundamentally believe that the individual is the wrong unit of analysis for organizations, right? Now, it's unfortunate because you have to hire individuals, you have to pay individuals, right? But here's the thing, right? Um, you could hire the smartest people in the world into your company and then lock them in broom closets for a year. They're going to do crappy work, right? Um, it's the interactions between people, right, and the combination of people and the systems that do that effectively that actually lead to, you know, organizational performance. And that's just, in my work, been beaten over the head with that in the data, that by far the most predictive stuff of macro level outcomes that we actually care about are, these structural sort of phenomena that emerge, again, depending on how effectively a company is managed. Now, one of the problems and one of the reasons it's hard to move to that also is that companies, and this is another structural problem, have not gone through the exercise of connecting the KPIs and the performance metrics they have, at the top of the organization. So like revenue, profitability, what have you, and then connecting that all the way down to typically where they also have metrics, which is like on the very front line of the organization. So for a lot of times, if you have salespeople, you do have some of these metrics, right? For those individuals, right? But the problem, of course, is understanding that whole tissue in the middle about how does this stuff at the front line actually bubble up to things like profitability. And a lot of times it's people just sort of making vaguely educated guesses. But or because some metric is easy to measure, they assume that that's actually what leads to higher performance. But of course, the issue is that pretty much no company has gone through the hard work of saying, okay, what do we actually care about? Let's go down. Okay, so if we say profitability matters, well, what predicts profitability at the divisional level, right? And then go beyond that. All right, well, what? And again, meaning that from a very quantitative, perspective, right, in terms of how people actually work, because again, that's the stuff that actually the whole reason companies exist is because together we can do something we couldn't do by ourselves, and so that's what it's about, right? And so that makes it very hard then to talk about what effective management is, even when you have this data, right? The problem, of course, is that there's still this disconnect because the people data by itself, without outcome metrics to relate it to, leadership will sometimes make decisions to try to improve these things. But, of course, if there's an opportunity, I mean, again, things like if you're a profitable company, doing massive layoffs is one of the dumbest things you can do. And this is, there's decades of research on this. However, the thing is that it's really easy to measure, profitability this quarter, right? And if I cut 10% of my workforce this quarter, right, then I'm going to make more money. Like, I guarantee it, you will, right? But the costs of that are much more amorphous, and they come into these people metrics, right? And this is sort of the last thing I'll get to, is that one of the issues is that those incredibly myopic, ineffective management decisions are opaque not only to leadership, but also to investors and to board members, right? And so if you're an investor, and I look at, I mean, again, I could look at like, let's say I take some large tech company and, the CEO there fires the entire R&D team, right? They're going to be more profitable this quarter, right? They will. Now, again, that's not hard to do, but the issue today is that those sort of things, if you're an investor, like what you should probably do is short that company, right? But that's opaque, and not even, and again, R&D team, you could say, well, that's future thing, but again, it's not even just that. It's if they just fire 10% of the workforce because they're so profitable, they're going to be overvalued, right? And I think the incentives around, management and investments are just all, they're just not aligned with what actually creates, value over the long term. And I think this is where people metrics have a really big role to play, right? Because they enable not all of that visibility, but an awful lot of visibility into those things, right? And that they enable leadership to be evaluated based on the actual changes that they make and the actual hard improvements they make, rather than doing, some, fun math to just fudge the numbers a little bit so that, this quarter is better and you hit some kicker, or beyond that, or just like, it's unclear, how good a job people are doing. And this is, I guess, I'll stop talking after this, but I think that there's this really big problem in the people space in general, and this is, I'd say, management overall into the business community, is that we conflate financial performance with managerial competence, which again, you could make me the CEO of Amazon tomorrow, and I probably make a bunch of dumb decisions, and I'm not going to affect their profitability this quarter, right? Like I'm not. And so, and again, I could make them more profitable by doing some stupid things of like firing a lot of people that again will not affect their profitability this quarter. And the problem is that we view it as acceptable for a company to copy what a very profitable other company is doing, despite the fact that it might be that, the sector for that product is hot. I mean, again, if you're, making GPUs right now, you'd basically have to be an idiot to lose money. Like it's really hard to lose money, right? On the other hand, maybe you are making, I don't know, cars, and the market for cars, just pretending the market for cars is going down. You could be the best managed company in the world, right? And, still be unprofitable. It's possible, right? Now, again, that doesn't mean the profit doesn't matter, but it does mean that assessing both the future prospects as well as, actually what's the value of these folks in management, like what should their compensation be? And again, this is a core people, in HR function, right? And is done incredibly ineffectively just by comparing to other companies. Like, well, this CEO is making that. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. Like if they're wasting money, like that doesn't tell me if there's any good. And I think this is where people metrics have to come into play to actually start to get at the meat of, showing what really matters and then tying that to, again, really hard, oversight for organizations.
Yeah, I think, well, you say a couple things there that I think are really interesting, which is, you could have a great product, you could have a great company, but if, like, as an example, if you were making horse carriages in 1935, and Henry Ford is pumping out,
I forget when
1,000 cars a day.
peak horse. I remember the peak horse in the U.S. is actually later than everyone thinks. It is like it is like 1930, but yes, that general.
Yeah, it is a little bit later.
Yeah.
And if you don't see the end of your product, right,
Yeah.
like then you're missing it. And I think the correlation to this is, and I think it is a direct correlation. What is happening with artificial intelligence right now?
Yep.
And you're seeing a number of companies, even in our space, very large HCM last week specifically announced that they're cutting almost 2,000 jobs.
Yeah.
About 9% of their workforce. And they said they will be replaced with AI.
Yeah.
And you're looking at this across the board. So I think from your perspective, and what, not only because you don't only work in an academic environment, right? You're consulting for, some investment firms. And again, you talked about investors. Yeah. How do investors see this right now? Yes, you can make the quick buck. I can cut 2,000 people in my workforce. The next couple of quarters are going to be great because I'm going to show profitability. But the long-term impact of that can be very serious.
Yes.
What's your view on this? I think AI is creating a lot of fear right now.
It is. Well, and I think the problem is that like large language models in particular create this case for like plausible automation, which I think is very problematic because right now the vast majority of people, even in this space, are not adequately assessing like what this piece of technology is actually good for. And I would argue it is good for some things, but it's much less than most folks think. And the problem, like you were saying, is that, when you fire these couple thousand people tomorrow, the cost, it doesn't mean you lose $1 billion like the next day. That's not how this works. If we talk about, technical debt in these systems, and again, there's a much longer discussion we could have about the efficacy of, using LMs and coding in a industrial software environment, which is like, I would basically never do that. At least in terms of, automating things versus, we could talk about it, but this is sort of the problem, right? Is that you have, vendors who are claiming certain things around how this stuff works. And then, it is complicated technology. And unfortunately, not enough people are interrogating how these things actually work. I do think that, again, it still gets to, though, what do we value, right? And this is the problem is if we talk about productivity, for example, for software developers, as the number of lines of code written, which, we've known for decades is a terrible metric of performance. But if that's what we call performance, then, a machine that can, extrude code faster than, a person can type is by definition more productive. Now, again, I would argue, though, that is not properly defining what we as what an organization cares about, right? And I would say that an organization, you care about, right, like better products, you care about like again, you do probably care about, profitability and revenue, right? But then the question is, what bubbles up to that? And you probably say, okay, better products, more stable products, all those things. Then the question, of course, is, well, what relates to that? And then you can go into things like, well, like the number of bugs in code really does matter, right? For actually milestone attainment. The idea of, doing things that other people haven't done before is really good for, again, just product variability. And when you start to get to those things, it's very clear immediately, actually, that LMs are really bad at that by themselves. Now, again, instead of if instead of like looking up on Stack Overflow how, in a different programming language to do function X, I have an LM do it. Fine, that's fine, right? And I think that's probably effective. That's this much, right? And again, it isn't a benefit, but it's not what's being promised, right, from the technology. But I think that, you have this real issue where people are not, like, again, going through that exercise. They want to get the very quick, sort of sugar rush of either cutting these things. But also, unfortunately, I think you have a lot of economists who are supporting this because, again, their traditional mode of analysis is at this very, simplistic task level, not looking systemically at how these things work. And I think that is currently exacerbating the problem.
Well, I don't think they know. I don't think they know how to analyze it, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
they're falling back
Yep.
on. We understand when we look at financials and we look at the quarterly report, the shareholder report, whatever it might be. What were your earnings per share? How much debt are you carrying? Do you have money to invest into the future? All those things. They understand how to analyze that, and it is a myopic set of metrics
Yeah.
that remove the most important factor in an organization's success, which is certainly how talented are the people you have
Yeah.
in order to carry you through the best and worst times.
Exactly. And if I were to use a technological example, which I think illustrates just how flawed this is, but ask, like, what is the productivity benefit of the computer mouse, right? So just imagine trying to use your computer or try to do work without a mouse. And I mean, that means a touchpad. It means literally like you don't have a cursor, right? Like you would die. Like productivity would drop to nearly zero. Now, what's fascinating is there haven't been like 1,000 economics papers written about how important the computer mouse is, but it is undeniably like way more important than almost anything else. Like, which is, and it's simple. But again, what's important though is that it is changing how people can work. And I think different class of AI technology do have that potential, but the way, the big stuff that actually is going to improve productivity, it's not right. Like this task level stuff, like that is fine. It's fine, right? I don't think there's very much of a future in that. But I do think that thinking much more creatively about how we integrate this into different interfaces, thinking of new types of interfaces, using different data-driven tools, because again, people are really bad at aggregating data from very large perspective, and I think there are ways that will make people much more effective. But I do think this really tunnel vision on task automation is corrosive for a number of areas, and it is something that folks will eventually stop. But I just hope that we don't realize that, by the time we have to like dig ourselves out of a hole of like many years of just doing things that destroy organizations, they hurt people's careers like needlessly, right?
Yeah,
That's what I'm concerned about. Yeah,
I think this is the real heart of the matter, which is let's have a hypothetical but not so hypothetical situation I'll put you in. You're sitting in the boardroom of a mid-market company worth a few $100 million and growing. And they're a product-based company, and you're sitting there with the C-suite and they're saying, we want to inject AI into the work that we're doing. What is your advice to them? What's the warnings you're providing? But what is ultimately, because this is why I wanted to talk to you today. What are you telling them? How do we operate in this environment as a leadership team?
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that, so there's two things. The first question is not, that you just use AI for whatever, you possibly can. It's what do you care about as an organization? Like what matters, right? And then, I do think the opportunity with a lot of these technologies is to redesign, workflows, processes in new ways that then, yes, does take advantage of the technology, but that, and more importantly, frankly, just dramatically improves the performance of the organization. But that requires thinking about processes, right? And so, which I don't think people are doing. Like I've seen very, very few companies that are doing that. Most of them, again, like you even use the software developer example, they're like, well, we're going to, start using Copilot, and then that means we can fire 2,000 people. Like that's not changing processes or anything like at all, right? It's just you're doing what you're still doing, and probably frankly doing it more ineffectively, but that's all you're doing, right? But of course, the question is, all right, well, now that we have, algorithms that can give me, more or less real time view of how the organization is functioning or other things like that, what does that mean about, how the reporting structure could change or how we organize teams or like those are the interesting things, and that's where you're actually going to get, the real huge performance increases. Like that's what it's going to be. But it requires thought, it requires planning, it requires testing. You're not going to get it right, at first. Again, I do think that the actual important change happening now is, again, the proliferation of data about work, right, at a scale that is unprecedented, and the speed with which that data is proliferating. And that is why using algorithms to understand that data, to provide insight into it, is important. But again, because things like speed are important, our current way of working for the vast majority of companies is not equipped to deal with things at that speed. And the one, just use a historical analogy, because Cliff, I think like I like some of these historical analogies. I think the example of the telegraph is particularly telling, right? So if you go back to the dawn of the telegraph, if you were in the newspaper industry, right? So there was like breaking a story internationally, that was not like a thing, right? That didn't happen, right? Because again, like news traveled at the speed of horses and people, and so yeah, like eventually a newspaper would reprint things, but like it would take weeks for that news to come. And so as a consequence, the idea of like a foreign correspondent also like didn't make any sense, right? Because why would you do that? Like they're going to send a letter, but so are other people, and it's still going to take weeks. Now, all of a sudden, when you have telegraph, and now it can take, seconds for news in one place to get somewhere else, that's actually where you have an entirely new organization. Actually, Reuters actually was, as an organization, was created during the telegraph era because all these, so some very, rich newspapers were able to hire foreign correspondents to then telegraph them back. But again, that also required them to change how they go to presses, because it wasn't just, okay, well, the point is that if we don't print today, like our competitor could print that later, but that how you laid out the paper, it wasn't as much of a, just methodical, like long process. And so that required the papers that survived, and a lot of them didn't. They survived because they redesigned their processes because, again, time was compressed. And I think we're seeing a very similar thing today, but I don't think we've seen, for my money yet, the equivalent of a new type of organization like a Reuters that is, again, new business model and processes, which is very important. Like again, the process part, we've seen sure new business models. I don't think we've seen processes that actually support doing things effectively. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I do think we're in an age right now where the difference between this innovation and practically every other innovation that has come before it is time. Everything, as you said, is compressed.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
And so I think you look at the bigger players in this market, and they're forcing this compressed time message. Like, and I think there's some truth that, like, what you and I talked about when we were on the floor of the NASDAQ a few weeks ago, and I said, you certainly could wait for the ROI to reveal itself. And it's going to pass you by, but that also doesn't mean that you need to, rush into the marketplace and start turning on a bunch of tools that you're not going to know how to use and fire a bunch of people and put your company in a really, really bad position a year and a half to 2 years from now, because it'll take that long for the effectiveness to reveal itself to an organization,
Yeah,
right? It's
well,
not.
no, but that's the reason though, right? The reason to start experimenting with things now and start using it is because, again, getting it right requires, again, changing how the organization functions, and that is very hard. And you almost certainly get it wrong at one point. But also, the actual KPIs that you want this to affect, I would argue, are things that happen on slightly longer
Yeah.
timescales, right? And so that takes a lot of time. So if you start today, you won't really know, to your point, for like a year or for longer than that. And so, but by that time, if someone else has, actually figured it out, like, you're screwed,
Well,
right?
that's the thing. Like,
Yeah,
if you have a crystal ball in some respects and say 12 months out, what position you want to be in? Do you want a position that your organization has begun to adopt and understand and started to make some change,
yeah,
or are you going to watch your competition doing that same thing?
yeah, yeah,
And by then, in at least in my view, for many companies, in that position a year from now, it could be too late
yes,
because I think there is an advantage that you can create for yourself and your organization right now that will reveal itself in about a
yeah.
year.
No, I
But if
think
you don't, the market is going to judge you.
no. Well, this is the thing, right? Is that it's the interesting thing here for my money is not the technology itself, right? This is not, and what I mean by that is that the things that are actually going to be really effective and that actually drive very large amounts of productivity change, they're around changing the way that work happens, the way that, again, data flows happen within an organization, right? Which is cultural change, right? That is, again, brought about by the technology itself, but this is a hard thing to do. And so what that means is, in a year, sure, could you buy the same tool your competitors use? You could. You can buy the same tool. You're not going to get nearly as much from it because you have to make all that cultural change. That cannot happen. You cannot buy that. That's not how that works, right? And so that's the problem, right? This is where that's what is most important. And again, the technology is a vehicle through which one can start to reimagine these things and understand, for your particular business, for your context, what should that look like? Because it's not going to be something that's just out of the box or you can copy someone else, right? But that's going to take time.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I'll end on this note and I think you and I agree on this. Like, this is as much a cultural problem as it is a technology problem, to be solved for. And if you're not doing both,
yes,
it will fail, right?
yeah,
And it is both,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
let's we'll close things out here. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about what's next for you.
yeah.
When's the next version of People Analytics coming out? What are you working on, and how can
Yeah.
people find you and connect with you?
Yeah. So no, I do have finished another book that is tentatively titled Blackjack Society, which is somewhat related to this, about the role of chance and probability on different outcomes and how that should shape how one manages, but then also does other things around other aspects of life that I just find interesting. So that's coming out. Yeah. Again, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Mastodon at bwaber at hci.social. I'm on Blue Sky at bwaber. So yeah, feel free to reach out there. And yeah, I'm doing a bunch of different things sort of in this area. Again, like you mentioned, that I forgot to mention earlier. Yeah, I've been working with a bunch of folks in the financial services industry around doing things like actually integrating people metrics into how investors value companies, as well as how they drive executive comp decisions and other things. So yeah, that's been pretty fun. And, I'll have some different stuff coming out in HBR, but also actually some law review pieces with some lawyers. So there's some very narrow areas of law where I can play a lawyer and work with some great folks out of Harvard Law and other places where we argue that it's a fiduciary duty of boards to do this sort of stuff. So we'll see. So this should be fun times.
It is. I think you're going to be a very valuable asset, in the months to come, because of the focus on people and technology. And so
Yeah.
I really, thank you. I'm grateful that you